Alright, yeah, welcome back to some more Magic Arena, and today we're going to be going back for a deck that I actually put up to a Patreon poll quite a while ago, but I poorly timed it, and Ravnica Allegiance ended up coming out. So what we're playing today is a green-black Izoni Reanimator list. So the idea behind this deck is to use Izoni as more of a value creature in this particular deck. So her Undergrowth says... basically, it checks the number of creature cards in your graveyard and then creates that many 1/1 black and green insect creature tokens for each creature card in your graveyard. And then you can pay a green and a black to sacrifice a creature to gain 1 life and draw a card. So the idea is that we're going to play Izoni, we're going to get lots of bug tokens, and then we're going to keep playing Izoni, legend ruling the Izoni, getting more bug tokens. So you might look at this deck and think that the Undergrowth count is a little bit low. That's kind of what I'm anticipating most people to say. But we're not actually aiming for an Undergrowth X20. This isn't a Lotleth Giant. This is basically just a value creature in a nutshell. And the fact that it can legend rule itself just means that we can keep looping them around. So even if Izoni's only making 2 creatures every turn, she's still making 2 creatures every turn. So she's going to be chumping a hell of a lot of the board state, clogging it up, which allows us to eventually value them out. So how do we go about valuing them out? Well, we have plenty of creatures that deal with enter the battlefield abilities. Our removal suite is basically all of that. We have 3 copies of Plaguecrafter, which is a 3-mana 3/2. When it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a creature or a planeswalker, and then each player who can't discards a card, which means that Plaguecrafter is always guaranteed to get us some sort of value, unless of course it dies in response and then forces us to discard. It's about the only exception, I suppose, in that regard. But this is really good once you've got yourself Journey to Eternity online. This is the build around card. Should have got to this right away, but Izoni is kind of the main focal point of Journey most of the time. So Journey to Eternity is a 3-mana enchantment. It says enchant creature you control, and when that creature dies, return it to the battlefield under your control, then return Journey to Eternity onto the battlefield transformed under your control. And it comes back as Atzel, Cave of Eternity, which can add 1 mana of any colour, and you can pay 5 mana to tap it, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So that's how we return Plaguecrafter every single turn, which means if your opponent is the kind of deck that plays 1 creature per turn and just tries to build up a clogged board state, it's just straight up not going to work if we have a Plaguecrafter in play. Same thing goes for if they're running Flyers as their main plan. We also have a copy of Crawl Harpooner here. So every single turn we can fight an Enigma Drake or a Crackling Drake or a Niv Mizzet with Crawl Harpooner. It will die, it will go back into the graveyard, and then next turn we can reanimate it again. So that's kind of the idea. Plaguecrafter, of course, will sacrifice itself, so that this is always in the graveyard. We also have Ravenous Chupacabra. If the sacrifice ability is not really going to cut it, we do have targeted removal here. 2 copies of Ravenous Chupacabra as a 4-mana 2/2, allows us to destroy any creature an opponent controls, as long as it doesn't have hexproof, of course, which Plaguecrafter gets around. We also have 3 copies of Vraska's Contempt, because we mostly deal with creatures as part of our removal, so we do need to bring in some non-creature based removal, because there isn't many things that can hit planeswalkers if they have creatures in play. So Plaguecrafter can of course hit planeswalkers, but if they have at least 1 creature, then we can't do that. So this is our way of targeting those things, because they are very high value and need to die immediately. We also have 3 copies of Vicious Offering as well. Gives target creature -2/2, some decent removal in the early game versus mono red. And if it's up against any big creature stuff, we can also use the kicker side to sacrifice a creature to give a creature -5/5 instead. So trading off a creature, which is not too bad for us because we get to reanimate, and give a creature -5/5, which gets around a lot of stuff. Kills Andanto Vanguard and things like that, so really nice there as well. Should be noted as well that Vicious Offering's kicker is part of the cost, so this is one way that we can actually flip Journey to Eternity. I should state that Journey to Eternity does have ways of being flipped at instant speed within our deck. We can kill it ourselves, so we're not really relying on our opponent to kill it, and we can also get under things like Vraska's Contempt as well. The way that we do that is we actually use turn 1 Llanowar Elves. So Llanowar Elves comes down on turn 1, and then on turn 2 we get ourselves a Swamp, and we play Journey to Eternity on Llanowar Elves. Turn 3 we play something like Plaguecrafter or Vicious Offering or Vraska to sacrifice the Llanowar Elves, and we flip Journey to Eternity. So that allows us to get past Vraska's Contempt and things like Conclave Tribunal. So a lot of the 4 mana removal spells, we managed to dodge that. So that is why we're running Llanowar Elves here. We can get this down real early. Now, we can't use Atzel very early, and there wouldn't be many uses for it being used early, but it's the fact that we actually get it flipped for the late game that is actually really important for us. Not many decks in the format at the moment run Assassin's Trophies and Field of Ruins, so once Atzel is flipped, it's flipped for good, which means any creatures that they kill are only temporary. We also have Thrashing Brontodon as well. This is a fun little interaction to flip Journey. So if we get Thrashing Brontodon down on turn 2 or turn 3, then we can follow that up with Journey, enchanting Thrashing Brontodon. We can then pay the 1 mana here on Thrashing Brontodon to sacrifice it to destroy an artifact or enchantment. We will target Journey to Eternity, but before Brontodon actually kills Journey, it will die as part of its cost, which means Journey's trigger goes first, turns it into a land, and then makes this effect fizzle, so we can flip it that way as well. We got lots of ways to flip Journey and get it down nice and early. 1 copy of Thrashing Brontodon as well is also very nice against the Wilderness Reclamation decks. We do have a pretty bad matchup against them in general, but this is one of our ways of beating them game 1. Game 2, we can bring in another Thrashing Brontodon to beat that as well. But it's very nice with Journey to Eternity as well, which means it's not completely dead card if your opponent's not running any enchantments or artifacts. Other than that, though, it is mostly just value creatures here. We're running 3 copies of Stitcher's Supplier to help us fill the graveyard once Journey has flipped. It's also very nice with a Journey flip as well, if you're attaching it to it, because when it enters the battlefield, it mills 3. When it dies, it mills 3. And then Journey also reanimates it straight from that point as well, so we get another mill there. So Journey to Stitcher's Supplier with Journey attached to it would mill 9 cards from our deck, which is very nice indeed. We also have 4 copies of Branchwalker to make sure that we hit our land drops on time. It's also quite nice as well to fill the graveyard with creatures. If we see something on top that we don't really need, then we can fill it to add to the undergrowth cost at the very least. Vraska Golgari Queen, we've kind of mentioned this one as well. 4 mana for a 4 loyalty Planeswalker. She can tick up +2 to sacrifice another permanent, so she can sacrifice the creature that has Journey stuck on it to flip that. That's a really, really nice swing there in terms of value. We get to gain 1 life and draw a card off of that as well, so not only do we flip Journey, get the creature back so we'd never killed it in the first place, maybe even getting an Enter the Battlefield ability trigger again, but we also get to gain 1 life and draw a card. That is a lot for a +2 on a Vraska. The -3 allows us to destroy target non-land permanent with converted mana cost 3 or less, so this has a few fringe situations. It is like 1 mana cost lower than it really ideally should be, but this can allow us to hit things like Enigma Drakes, little creatures along the way as well, so anything of use. Most of the creatures that Journey's going to be attached to as well will have the -3, so for some reason we don't want to tick up 2, we can even -3 and do it that way as well. And finally, the -9, you get an emblem with whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, that player loses the game. So no matter what life total they're on, if they've got an infinite life combo, we can still win through that means as well, because any creature then is a lethal threat, and that means that Atzel becomes a lethal threat because it can repeatedly bring back creatures from our graveyard to threaten our opponent. 2 copies of Biogenic Ooze, which is the new addition from Ravnica Allegiance. 5 mana for a 2/2, so it is a little bit flimsy. However, when it enters the battlefield, it is guaranteed to make you a 2/2 Ooze creature token, and if it survives until the end step, then it actually puts a +1/+1 counter on each ooze you control. So the longer this is out, the bigger these oozes get. So we're going to run these ones in here because we can actually bring them back with Journey to Eternity. So even if our opponent does kill the Biogenic Ooze, we can bring it back again, and then any oozes we have left over on the battlefield can get some pumping from this card indeed. I'm going to be basically testing this out. I'm not sure if it's the most powerful card in this deck, but I wanted to add something in from Ravnica Allegiance anyway, because this was actually a pre-new set kind of deck that I built, so we've just kind of added to this one. Underrealm Lich, probably one of my favourite cards in this deck, honestly, to trigger with, because it has so much synergy with the deck. So 5 mana for a 4/3, it says if you would draw a card, instead look at the top 3 cards of your library, and then put 1 into your hand, the rest into your graveyard. So every single turn that we draw a card, we get to look at 3 cards, everything else that we don't want goes into our graveyard. So that accounts for the Undergrowth on Izoni. That actually gives us targets for Journey to Eternity. And we get to look at 3 cards to decide what card we want in hand. So we get to choose all of our non-creature stuff, essentially, to keep. We can also pay 4 life, and it gains Indestructible, so it is very hard to deal with as well. 4/3 means it dodges a little bit of removal, but not quite enough, so it is kind of a heavy target for our opponent. We can also bring it back with Journey later on as well if they don't exile it, so very nice there. If we don't want to pay the life, that is, then we can just let it die. Or maybe it just gets milled as part of Stitcher's Supplier, so once Journey's online, then this can combo and help this out. Another fun little interaction as well is all of the extra draw that we actually have in this deck. Vraska on the tick up 2 here allows us to draw a card, which the replacement effect on Underrealm Lich would mean that the Vraska would be looking at 3 cards, so she's almost brainstorming but in a graveyard kind of way. Really powerful. Izoni does the same thing as well. When she sacrifices one of her insect tokens, we get to look at 3 cards and fill the graveyard, which means future Izonis are going to have a bigger Undergrowth count as well. So this is a nice super value synergistic deck here. It's not going to be doing anything too crazy. We're not going to see Izoni X50 or anything like that, but we might see quite a lot of insect tokens coming out throughout these episodes that we put out for this one. So before we go into the sideboard, the mana base needs to be talked about a little bit. We have 6 swamps, 8 forests, because we are trying to get the Llanowar Elves down on turn 1 so that we can do the turn 2 Journey to Eternity, flip it on turn 3. So we are skewed slightly more in that direction. We also have a double green on turn 3, and we don't need to deal with double black until turn 4. But we can actually accommodate for that as well, because we do have the 4 Overgrown Tombs, 4 Woodland Cemeteries, and finally 2 copies of Memorial to Folly. Actually balances out this quite nicely as well, which means we actually have equal black and green sources, because we are mostly split evenly here. We have some gold cards. It's mostly split even. So Memorial allows us to go back and get any creature we want. If we don't have the Journey to Eternity online, then this is a nice way of also just getting back some of our value creatures if and when we need them. So let's talk about the sideboard, shall we? So against heavy removal decks, we want to bring in things like Shaper's Sanctuary. 1 green enchantment. Whenever a creature you control becomes the target of a spell or an ability an opponent controls, you may draw a card. So if they try to kill any of our creatures in any way, or even bounce them, we get to draw a card in response. So not only are they putting a creature most of the time back into our graveyard, which is pretty much where we want it to be anyway. If it's not on the battlefield, it might as well be in the graveyard. So not only are they kind of helping us there, but we're also getting to draw a card as well, filling up our hand, comboing with the Underrealm Lich as well. So if we have this in play and an Underrealm Lich, we get to look at 3 cards and mill 2 others. So it's really a losing battle at that point if we have Shaper's Sanctuary in play. It's beautiful. It's also a May ability, so we can't mill ourselves. Speaking of mill, Underrealm Lich is a replacement effect for draw spells. So we don't actually lose the game for drawing our last card in our deck. This is actually a replacement effect. It says if you would draw a card instead. And the way that mill works is it says if you would draw a card and you can't, then you lose the game. So we're not drawing cards with Underrealm Lich in play, so we can't lose to mill, which means all we need to do is have some sort of board presence online, Atzel preferably, to make sure that we can live through that and never lose Underrealm Lich. 3 copies of Duress against the control matchups, just to make sure that anything that we want to land sticks, because if we get an Atzel in play and stick it, then we're going to win against control most of the time. We can also take down Wilderness Reclamations. If we're up against Mono Blue Tempo, we can grab all of their counters, so that when we actually go heavy removal from the sideboard, we can resolve our removal spells a little bit more often. Speaking of, 2 Moment of Cravings here. 2 mana, -2/-2, and we gain 2 life, so really good against the mono reds, really good against mono blue tempo as well, takes care of a lot of the creatures that they will be attaching their Curious Obsessions to. 2 copies of Kraul Harpooner, because I absolutely hate drakes, so we're going to be bringing in plenty of removal for them. If we can cycle Kraul Harpooner against the Drake deck, they're going to lose, because it's going to be very difficult for them to actually get any damage in. Their only exception would be, at that point, would be Ral and Murmuring Mystic that we have to deal with, but we're kind of teched out to beat that kind of stuff anyway. So this is just nice for the Flyers decks and things like that. 1 Thrashing Brontodon. If we are dealing with enchantments and artifacts, then we're happy to have an extra 2 extra copy in here, 2 copies total. Also synergizes quite nicely with Journey there. 2 copies of Ritualist Soot, again, for the creature matchups. This does hit quite a little bit of our deck, but we don't really care. Stitcher's Supplier gets benefits from dying. A lot of our 3-drops as well are better in the graveyard so that we can reanimate them with Journey to Eternity. And we get to keep some of our bigger, more powerful stuff like Izoni, Underrealm Lich, and Chupacabra to a certain extent. Even Biogenic Ooze gets to stick around through a Ritual of Soot. So it's not the best board wipe in the game, but it is the best that Black has to offer, so it's kind of what we have to deal with. We certainly don't want to be Cry of the Carnariuming our own stuff anyway, because that would have them be exiled. And finally, versus Control, we also have Carnage Tyrant, because what's worse than one Carnage Tyrant? A Carnage Tyrant that gets to reanimate every other turn. So 7/6 with Trample and Hexproof that can't be countered, so swings right through. Settle the Wreckage is basically the only thing that's going to win our opponent the game at that point. I hope you enjoyed this deck tech anyway, guys. The link to the deck list is down below if you're interested in that. Stick around to the end card as well, where I will have a link to the first matchup for this deck. I hope you enjoy it, and without further ado, be sure to like, subscribe, hit that bell icon, all that jazz, and I'll see you all next time. Bye bye.